So last time we were at the Council of Nicaea in AD 325, and they didn't keep, at least it is not passed down to us, that there was some particular minutes or something of the council kept. But one of the things that we know that for sure that they did in the month and a half or so that they were gathered together was that there was worship together. So next slide, this is a hymn that was written by Clement of Alexandria around AD 200. So at the time of the Council of Nicaea, this hymn was already about a century, a little bit more than a century old. But it's a hymn of praise, and even though it originates from Alexandria, it was clearly very widely sung in many places across the church. And it may have been used as a confirmation hymn for people who were being baptized and joining the church. And so tender youth, those who are young in the faith, those who are young in life, this has been used as a song for children down through the ages. It is the first hymn written that is not in the New Testament that we have an author for. And one of the earliest hymns that we have from the immediate post-New Testament era. And it's still in many hymnals today. The current Lutheran hymnal has it. The celebration hymnal that we've been using here for about almost 20 years does not have this, but it's still used in a lot of hymns. And so through devious ways, and devious meaning wandering, not, evil, not undermining, not any of that, but it means it's about the idea that we as sheep go astray. We wandering paths, deviating from the truth, that we find various winding ways through life, and that life provides us with things that give us wandering ways, and that we zig and zag and learn through suffering and difficulty. And this sounds very 19th century here, because this is a translation that was done in the 19th century by a guy named Henry Martin Dexter of New Hampshire, so local. But shepherd of tender youth, guiding in love and truth through devious ways, Christ our triumphant King. We come thy name to sing, and here our children bring to join thy praise. Thou art our holy Lord, O all-subduing word, healer of strife. Thou didst thyself abase, that from sin's deep disgrace thou might save our race and give us life. Thou art the great high priest, thou hast prepared the feast of holy love. And in our mortal pain, none calls on thee in vain. Help thou dost not disdain, help from above. Ever be thou our guide, our shepherd, and our pride, our staff and song. Jesus, thou Christ of God, by thine enduring word, lead us where thou hast trod, make our faith strong. So now, until we die, sound we thy praises high, and joyful sing. Infants in the glad throng, who to thy church belong, unite to swell the song to Christ our King. Anything stand out to you about this hymn? About the words, about the things that it says, about as you come to the end of the 2nd century, what is the hymn writer thinking about here? Is there anything that strikes you about this? Shirley. Okay. Ray? Mm-hmm. Where Jesus walked, yeah. Okay. But there's a huge connection to the idea of the Word made flesh. Jesus walked. The work of God. And so this is, when we think about songs that we sing here and the things that we sing here, we're always looking for something that the words have substance, the words have some depth. They tell us something that is substantive and significant about the faith. They give us some deeper meaning. And I think that that's true of Clement's hymn here. But this is, a hymn that is 1,800 years old. And so you could translate it into a little bit more modern sounding words if you wanted to. Hymn writers seem to love these and thous and that sort of talking. I guess musically that works in some significant ways. But Clement of Alexandria, who wrote this, said, we cultivate our fields, praising. We sail the sea, hymning. That is, singing hymns. The believer's whole life is a holy festival. The believer's sacrifices are prayers and praises and scripture readings before meals, psalms and hymns during meals and before bed, and prayer again during the night. And by these we unite ourselves to the heavenly choir. So Clement, speaking from the end of the 2nd century, says, make your life as a Christian a life of song and praise, that you might lift your voice and sing and pray. Do I need to be louder? Okay. Can you help me with that, Will? That I would be louder? Okay. So Clement makes the argument that the Christian life is to be sung through, that we sing all along the way, that we sing and pray all through the day. And so he wrote a hymn that we still have and that is still sung in the church today in a number of places. It's still in some hymnals. Particularly in the Lutheran hymnal is a large hymnal that is used by a significant group of Christians. And there's some places in the Eastern Church where this is still a song that is sung 18 centuries on. And so when they gathered together at Nicaea for the First Council of Nicaea, this hymn was already a century old, but it's probably the sort of thing that they would have sung together. So next slide, back to Athanasius. So Athanasius is a guy that he picked up a whole bunch of different nicknames along the way. And the nickname that he was known by his enemies as was the Black Dwarf. He was a dark-skinned man from southern Egypt and not very tall. And it was very interesting to me that when I was looking for images of Athanasius, that almost all the images that people have made of Athanasius down through the years since then, he's depicted as very pale and tall. And he was neither. So I actually found a couple of images where he is depicted with darker skin because that is apparently who he really was. But the one at the upper right where he's pictured with Cyril, who is later Bishop of Alexandria, almost a century after him, but the one on the right, when you see the whole images, makes him very tall and very thin. He wouldn't be called the Black Dwarf if that were true. That wasn't that was an epithet against him, not something that was supposed to be humorous. But Athanasius is a man who was born in Egypt, educated in Alexandria, which was a center of great learning. He was born at the end of the 3rd century and died in 373 AD in his late 70s. An early biographer of Athanasius says that Alexander, who was the bishop of Alexandria at the time, was looking out the window, and there were a group of boys playing down at the shore, and he realized that Alexander realized that what the boys were doing was pretending to baptize one another. And so he sent some of his guys out to bring these boys in so he could give them some talking to. And he determined that this young boy, Athanasius, was the guy who was the ringleader of this. And he asked Athanasius to explain what he'd been doing. And Athanasius gave him a correct reading of what baptism was about, how it was supposed to be done, the words that were supposed to be said, and the way that it was supposed to be done. At which point, Bishop Alexander decided to declare that the baptisms that Athanasius, as a boy, had done on these other boys were valid, and that these boys were now in the church because they had been baptized into the church in the correct way by a guy who had not ever been ordained or anything else. So this is Baptist-like stuff, the Spirit is upon me and I go forth and baptize. But that it was correct practice, it was correct terminology, it was therefore valid. And then he warned young Athanasius never to baptize anyone again who hadn't been catechized, that they needed to go through the preparatory process. But he invited all that group of boys to join a pastoral training program that he was running as the Bishop of Alexandria. And so this is how Athanasius came into the church, is by this means. At least this is the legend that is passed down to us, the story that comes to us. And so he became a deacon, works of service and mercy, and by this time deacons worked for bishops because the bishop controlled the funds that were used for benevolent purposes, and so deacons, in carrying those out, worked directly for the bishop. That had become the standard. But he became a man who was steeped in theology and steeped in the Word of God, and he became the loudest and most persistent voice in opposing what became known as Arianism. Arius was a presbyter who was in Libya, and Athanasius is a deacon in Alexandria, and so this is a thing that is going on in North Africa, but it is influencing the whole church in the West and to some extent the church in the East as well. And the fundamental point, as we talked about last week, is the issue that the Arius said that the Son, being the Son, was a creation of the Father and subordinate to the Father. That a son is always subordinate to a father, and that therefore it made sense that the Son was lesser in the Godhead, and that the Son, being begotten by the Father, must come after. And so that there was a point when there was no Son, there was no Jesus at some point. And Arius had gotten some musical people to write some hymns that rejoiced in this, that there was a point when Jesus was not. Athanasius said, whoa, time out, that's not right. That doesn't work. One of the things that Athanasius shot back was, you can't have a father unless there's a son. He's not the Father unless he's the Father of somebody. And so that the Father and the Son go together, and that the Son is begotten of the Father. He is not made by the Father. He is part of the substance of the Father. They are one God. And so Athanasius said the Son is from the very beginning, that he is from eternal. He is of old. Therefore, he has no beginning, as the Father has no beginning. And the Son is begotten of the substance of the Father, and that makes them one, but two persons. And that the Son is there at the creation, and that this is fundamental to the divinity of Christ and his ability to save us. If he's not fully divine, how can he bring salvation? And so Athanasius, he is a guy who pounded the table and wrote pages and pages and pages on the subject of Christ, fundamentally divine and fundamentally human. And he's the first great voice in the church to write about this. And so last week we talked about, he came to the Council of Nicaea with Alexander, his bishop, and they argued, and at the end, the position of Athanasius was victorious, and Constantine, the emperor, endorsed it, and Arius was sent into exile, and the only two bishops that voted with Arius' position at the Council of Nicaea were also exiled. Game over, right? Yeah, not even. Less than 2 years later, Arius came back from exile. And Constantine eventually decided that maybe Arius was right. And almost the whole church became Arians, which we regard as heresy today. But almost the whole church fell into this heresy. Athanasius, within a couple of years, becomes the Bishop of Alexandria. And apparently not because that was part of his master plan. Alexander is dying and he's laying on his deathbed and he says, "Find me Athanasius, I want to talk to him." And the legend has it, the story is told, that Athanasius fled. That he didn't want to go talk to the bishop when the bishop was dying because he was pretty sure that the bishop was going to say, "You've got to take this thing on and be the next bishop," and he really didn't want to do that. So Athanasius ran away, basically. That didn't help him, however, because as Alexander lay dying, he kept saying, get Athanasius to be the new bishop." So when it was time to appoint what had functionally become kind of an archbishop or a patriarch, to use the Eastern Church terminology, bishops from across Egypt gathered together, and from Libya gathered together in Alexandria to decide who the next bishop was going to be. And Christians from all over Alexandria gathered at the same time. Bishops were elected by some means, which was basically public at the time. And so the bishops had intended apparently to get together and elect someone in their meeting. But the people of the church at Alexandria came, kind of crashed the meeting, stood outside and chanted, and they chanted the name of Athanasius to the point where the bishops thought, well, okay, it's going to be Athanasius. So he became the Bishop of Alexandria by acclamation and served for more than 40 years in that role. During that time, the next 4 emperors exiled Athanasius from Alexandria on 5 different occasions. He spent 17 of the 47 years, I think it was, that he was Bishop of Alexandria in exile in various places, all because he wouldn't get on board with Arianism. Because despite the Council of Nicaea, Arianism had become the official position of basically the church. So in his lifetime, although he was called the Black Dwarf by people who disliked him, who were legion, he became known as Athanasius contra mundum, against the world. There was a point where there was no significant voice in the church on this issue of the divinity of Christ, except for Athanasius, in the entire Western church. In the church at Alexandria, Antioch, across North Africa, Rome, Athens, Ephesus, he was a lone voice. He was indeed against the world. And there was controversy that dogged him all the way along. When he was appointed bishop, those who disliked him came back and said, he's not old enough to be a bishop. You got to be 30 years old, and we think he isn't. And so there was some dispute about when he had been born and whether he was actually 30 and whether the 30 years old was actually a rule or not. But there were a lot of people at the time that believed that if you're going to rise to a position like bishop, you ought to be at least 30. And some of that was driven by the sense that Jesus had waited until he turned 30 to begin his ministry. So we don't know for sure that that was true, but Jesus had waited. He certainly did not begin his ministry when he was 21 or something. He was certainly around 30, and 30 had some symbolic value in the Jewish culture. In general, you were not allowed to become a rabbi and teach publicly until you became 30 in Jewish culture at the time. They believed that there was a need for you to have some life experience, some wisdom accumulated, that you needed some age. And so this is one of the reasons why Saul, who later is converted and becomes Paul the Apostle, but the young Saul is not actually on the Sanhedrin. He's just one of their helpers because he's not apparently 30 yet. He's not old enough to join the group. Even if he's smart enough, he's not old enough. So there was controversy about that for Athanasius, and he was eventually accused of all manner of wrongdoing as people attempted to dislodge him from his position as the bishop at Alexandria and throw him out of the church. But Athanasius, contra mundum, against the world. He is known today in the church as the father of orthodoxy and as the pillar of the church, because we see him as the guy who defended fundamental points of theology, fundamental things that we believe and we just accept to be true. The things that we accept as the baseline are things that Athanasius defended for his whole life, really, and argued very strongly, wrote very strongly about these things. He was sent into exile in Rome at one point, and so while he was in Rome, the bishop of Rome, a guy named Liberius, at the instigation of the emperor, had Athanasius excommunicated from the church. Even though he was the bishop of Alexandria, he remained the bishop, however, and subsequently returned to Alexandria. Liberius, by the way, is the earliest of the bishops of Rome to not be considered a saint by the Catholic Church, for what that's worth. He's the first guy on that list who doesn't have saint in front of his name on the official Roman Catholic list. Athanasius finally returns to Alexandria for good in AD 366. So 7 years before he died, he returned finally when he was about 70 years old from his final of his 5 exiles. Athanasius is the first to publish the list of the 27 books of the New Testament. He sent that out he sent an annual letter at Easter to the whole church at Alexandria, which was shared with churches across Egypt every year, even when he was in exile. And he, in one of those letters, he listed the 27 books of the New Testament as an information thing, just to remind you. His list is not, this is what I'm proposing, or this is what we should do, or this is just what was decided. It's a list that says, just as a reminder, these are the 27 books of the New Testament. He also wrote a biography of a man that became known as Anthony of the Desert, who was a monk who had moved into the desert and lived as a hermit. Athanasius' biography of him is very widely published, very widely read, and it became a huge inspiration to others to adopt a monastic life or to become desert hermits. Athanasius' fingers are on a bunch of different things. But Athanasius against the world, but he stood in so doing for the divinity of Jesus Christ and for fundamentals of the doctrine of the Trinity that are still core to us today. So we thank him for that. So next slide. So his big, the thing that he wrote that is most focused on this issue is called On the Incarnation. And so here's what he said: none then could bestow incorruption, but he who had made. That is, no one can cleanse you from sin except the Creator. None can restore the likeness of God save his own image. That is, no one can bring you back to the likeness of God, to being God's children, to being image bearers for him, except for someone who is truly the image of God. No one can quicken, that is, bring you back from death, but the life. I am the way, the truth, the life. No one can teach but the Word incarnate, the living Word. And he, to pay our debt of death, must also die for us and rise again as our first fruits from the grave. Mortal, therefore, must his body be. Corruptible his body could not be. So, Athanasius makes a case very strongly that Jesus has to be God incarnate in order to accomplish the work of salvation, and that he has to be both truly God and truly man. And so Athanasius is the first guy to write post-New Testament about this fundamental element of the faith in an era where almost anybody went to one extreme or the other. He's fully God and therefore he's not really man at all, or he's fully man and therefore not really God. But Athanasius said, no, he's fully God and he is fully man. And he was a very strong proponent of this. He argued very, very forcefully for this. Only the Creator could heal those marked and marred by sin. That only God himself could restore us to a likeness with him, could make us truly in his image and restore that in us. Only the source of life could give us eternal life. Only the Word made flesh could speak the good news to us. Christ, fully God and fully man. This became orthodoxy and is core to the faith today. And of course, many have deviated from it along the way and still do. But this is the point that people deviate from. And this is the thing that Athanasius is the first guy to really forcefully put this into words and argue this in the church, since Paul, basically. So, and then next slide. Here's another thing that Athanasius said, and this will sound familiar to you. At least it ought to. Do not be surprised if we frequently repeat the same words on the same subject. Could you imagine Pastor Jim saying that? Or me? I mean, for all those who are like, yeah, you say the same thing over and over again? Yes. Yes. Athanasius said so. It's still true. For since we are speaking of the counsel of God, therefore we expound the same sense in more than one form, lest we should seem to be leaving anything out and incur the charge of inadequate treatment. For it is better to submit to the blame of repetition than to leave out anything that ought to be set down. And pretty much every preacher, pastor, teacher ever since had been living by these words. Say the same things over and over and over again as necessary. But it's the same message, it's the same fundamental thing. Keep coming back to that same stuff. And so, so I mean, these are words, our story never changes. We preach and teach and instruct the same things that others have preached and taught down through the ages. We keep saying the same things because they are true. So, but Athanasius is one of the first to put pen to paper and point out that we keep saying the same stuff over and over again, and that's what we're supposed to do. That preaching and teaching is not about coming up with something new and different. It's not about coming up with something exciting that nobody has thought of before. It's about the same stuff. We come back always to the same thing.